Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. A month after its parliamentary elections, Lebanon is still sinking into the abyss with no political center to stabilize the turbulent system. No major group or coalition emerged. Many new members are unknown qualities with questionable loyalties. The economy is crashing and everyday life becomes ever harder to negotiate. How can Lebanon emerge out of this crisis? And what are the military and energy implications for Israel? Joining us from Central Israel to discuss this topic is retired Colonel Jacques Neriah, who is a former senior official at the IDF Intelligence Directorate and late Premier Yitzhak Rabin's advisor. Thank you for joining us, Colonel.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure indeed. Also joining us are Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the co-host of TV7 Middle East Review, a co-panelist at Powers in Play, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. It's always a pleasure as well. Also joining us, of course, is our TV7 Editor-at-Large, host of Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding of today's topic, Lebanon. The complexities are many.
So here we are again at one of those junctions of domestic policy and foreign policy or national security policy. And one would have thought that because of what you just described, the dire straits in which Lebanon finds itself, people there, including politicians, would focus on their internal problems and try to solve them. But either in spite of or because the problems are insoluble, it turns out that many of the politicians, not only Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, but also many of the new members with no political records have gone to the extreme and are pushing towards confrontation with Israel for various reasons, which my two colleagues here will elaborate on. So the feeling in Israel, especially following the Chariots of Fire exercise held a few weeks ago, is that tension with Lebanon is real and could conflagrate into a confrontation, perhaps a military campaign, as early as this summer.
Dr. Lerman, are we on a course of collision?
Potentially. I recently wrote a piece about the fisherman's wife. It's a legend that Pushkin put into rhyme, asking for more and more until she brought herself back to ruin. The story of Lebanon may be similar. There is a great opportunity ahead for Lebanon. An understanding with Israel on the delineation of the EEZ border will, I think, will meet with a generous Israeli response and will enable Lebanon to actually prospect and ultimately benefit from energy production, draw investors, stabilize the economy, give a chance to a country that has come to the verge of ruin. If and I read Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah's statement, Hezbollah's statements, as leaving some crack in the door for that possibility. But the basic instinct of demanding more and more, laying a totally absurd claim also to the area of Karish and Tanin, which are 100% within the Israeli EEZ, as Lebanon itself drew it in previous negotiations. So keep pushing this effort to keep pushing their ambitions southwards could lead to a confrontation which would be ruinous first and foremost for Lebanon itself. The chief of staff of the IDF was very blunt recently, speaking about the ruin that could come to much of Lebanon if Hezbollah initiates a confrontation. And the Lebanese should take this very, very seriously.
Colonel Neriah, do you see it in the same light?
Well, I beg to differ a little bit, not so much, but basically I join more the position that Amir has put forward, that because of domestic problems, they are trying to concentrate on issues which are unsolvable at the outcome. First of all, let's look at what's happening. There are two positions in Lebanon: the position of the government and the president concerning the limitation of the maritime borders between Israel and Lebanon, and there's the position of Hezbollah. Now, Lebanon has presented in 2013 a line which draws from the Lebanese coast till a point called 23, and this point creates a dispute area between us and Lebanon of 860 kilometers. But what happened is afterwards there was the discovery of the gas field of Karish, and the Lebanese decided that to change their position. Not officially. The position of 2013 was given to the United Nations. And now the claim is that the real line, because of internal problems in Lebanon, and because of the fact that Karish is there nearby and offers an opportunity for Lebanon, so the line that the Lebanese are presenting ends at point 29. Creating a dispute area of 1,430 square kilometers, which is not bound in any legal issue. So now the Lebanese government is saying, okay, let's discuss. What is there to discuss? The US envoy has presented already a median line between us and Lebanon. Lebanon has refused it. And the Lebanese, the opposition, the bloc of the newcomers, are asking the government to change its position officially and to present to the UN a new position. But here is the surprise. It seems, according to rumors in Lebanon, that President Aoun is negotiating an issue concerning his son-in-law, which is blacklisted by the Americans, in order to lift this blacklist and enable him to present himself as a candidate to the presidency in October. So at this point, there's the good guy is the good cop is the government, and the bad guy is the Hezbollah. Hezbollah has decided to put forward a position impossible to accept, neither for the Americans nor for the Lebanese government. As such, he is in fact presenting and putting himself at the center and saying, you will not disarm me. This was in the election campaign. I will fight Israel on the Karish oil field. And I suggest to take those elements seriously, because I mean there's a sensation in Lebanon, a feeling that Hezbollah is turning the maritime border into the new Shab'a farm, which are disputed between us and Lebanon.
Indeed. With that being said, Hezbollah is the big loser, if you will, from the last parliamentary elections, not necessarily losing its Shiite seats, where it regains its power all over, including its ally Amal, but losing much of its allies, if you will, something that has diminished its majority within the minority parliament that was incapable of functioning regardless of whether it has a majority or not. Now we hear, as Colonel Neriah also mentioned, that Jabran Basil, the son-in-law of Michel Aoun, is looking to run against Samir Jiajia, the leader of the Christian Lebanese forces, who is an arch enemy of Hezbollah. And there is here a split within the Christian Maronite community, which is the most powerful one, in which on the one hand you have the anti-Hezbollah camp of Jiajia, and you have the pro-Hezbollah camp, or at least corrupt to the core, and therefore supportive of Hezbollah, of Jabran Basil, and we see this battle of power probably going to bring Lebanon into even a more precarious stage, where the current president, Michel Aoun, will probably continue as president until the day, well, God knows when that is going to happen, that he would be replaced.
Well, no one in the warring factions of the Lebanese Maronites is pro-Hezbollah. They are only pro themselves. if it suits their purpose at one particular time to ally themselves with this or that group, they do it. And obviously, Hezbollah, backed by Iran, is now the most powerful force in Lebanon. And we should mention that the presidency, as well as the command of the army, are reserved for Christians under the Lebanese system. Now, there are families, there are dynasties in Lebanese politics, not only Christians. We all know the names, the Jamails, the Shamuns, Farangias, the Jumblats, the Hariris, all of these. And Mr. Basil, whom you mentioned, almost like faulty towers. But this is Gibran Basil. This shows you the dilemma that President Biden is facing, both in Saudi Arabia and in Lebanon. On the one hand, he's anti-corruption and pro-democracy, and Mohammed bin Salman
as long as it suits him.
No, because as long as the priorities allow him to. But when he is pressed, as is now the problem with Saudi Arabia, with oil and all of that, or in Lebanon, where he wants the more moderate faction to succeed, but this faction is led by someone he is personally against. What can be done? So eventually, of course, they all come to the conclusion that President Eisenhower once expressed by saying about someone in Latin America, he is an SOB, but he's our SOB. So let's have him rather than the other sides.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, I think Lebanese politics are still under the shadow of the summer of 2020. It was the explosion of Beirut, the sense that something has gone catastrophically wrong with the country, and that Hezbollah, to some extent, bears a central responsibility for the situation in which Lebanon finds itself. And I think that's the undercurrent that was reflected in the election results. There are even Shiite leaders, even people who were involved with the founding of Hezbollah originally, who are now saying that Hassan Nasrallah should be the first to be hanged, and that for what happened to Lebanon. Now, that puts Hezbollah to some extent in a corner, and corners are dangerous places for well-armed and very teethy animals like Hezbollah. However, until now, there were three good reasons for Hezbollah not to go to war. One is the Iranian nuclear file, because they are the ultimate deterrent in the Iranian arsenal. The second was the entanglement in Syria, which is now waning because the war is more or less has been fought to a standstill. And the third is Israeli deterrence. Now, deterrence is a quality that tends to erode over time. And so the Israeli military has made quite a deliberate and I would say even a noisy effort recently to restore deterrence. The manner in which a very large maneuver was now held in Cyprus, in terrain which was openly and without hesitation identified as being similar to the terrain that deep penetration raids would be fought in Lebanon. All of this is meant to enhance deterrence at this point of crisis. But if Hezbollah persists, as Jacques suggested, on a course of collision, it may indeed come to pass.
Colonel Neriah?
Well, first I would like to, some remarks concerning the Christian community in Lebanon. We have reached a point where no one could believe that the president of Lebanon would say to the Pope that Hezbollah is protecting the Christians in Lebanon. This is unheard of in the Lebanese politics, unheard of Christian politics in Lebanon. then you talk about the loss or the failure of Hezbollah during the elections. You're right. All the Shiite seats are with Hezbollah and Amal, and some of its allies are lost their seats in parliament. However, if you look today at what's happening in the parliament, the first battle was concerning the election of the speaker. The duo Hezbollah Amal succeeded in putting again Berry as the speaker, and also his deputy. Also, out of 16 committees in the Lebanese parliament, 12 are held by Amal, Hezbollah, and their allies. So I mean, let's look at the situation as is. Hezbollah is an old foe who knows how to behave in the Lebanese parliament, and he got hold of the parliament. And as such, I mean, his way to behave in Lebanon and to govern and to control the government has not changed. And I think, on the contrary, it has gotten worse. Finally, I say that concerning deterrence. Deterrence, as Eran said, is bilateral. We deter Hezbollah, but on the other hand, we are deterred by Hezbollah. We are deterred by 150,000 missiles that he can fire on Israel. We are deterred by the fact that, look at what happened. We discovered 10 tunnels from Lebanon deep inside Israeli territory. And what was Israel's response? We put cement in it. We put cement. This is really, the Hezbollah laughed at this. If this is the response of Israel, this only demonstrates that Israel is weak and is not interested in a conflict. And this is the advantage that Hezbollah has upon us.
Is it weak or is it comfortable? And when we're talking about the remarks by Michel Aoun to the Pope, it ultimately was a lie, but again, a lie that is derived about comfortable from current circumstances within Lebanon. How do you see this, Mr. Oren, at a time when we do see that the horizon for Lebanon, economically speaking, is not becoming any better? The IMF keeps saying that even the initial stages are not being implemented for reform in order to enable a bailout of some sort. The state reserve stood at 25 billion just 2 years ago and is significantly diminished since. Where is the silver lining at the end of the tunnel?
Well, as Jacques said, cement was put on it. So there is no silver lining. There is no lining at all. And the economic crisis is also a security crisis for Israel, because migrants are coming over to ask for work in Israel. They are desperate. And another factor is that the Palestinians are once again becoming a group Israel has to contend with in South Lebanon. And in fact, the only time that Israel retaliated against Lebanon within Lebanese territory was quite recently, when Palestinians launched rockets at Israel. And the deterrence that all of us talked about has to do not only with Israel avoiding any attack within Lebanon, but also when a Lebanese person is being killed outside of Lebanon, in Syria, for instance, Nasrallah orders retaliation. And Israel goes out of its way if it attacks an Iranian proxy, a Shiite militia, or a similar group, to ascertain that there are no Lebanese there.
And yet, Hassan Nasrallah stays in his bunker, which means something. Colonel?
Well, as I said, ultimately Israel does have the means to at least reduce Hezbollah so significantly that all its bitter foes in Lebanon and those who have an account to settle for the role Hezbollah played in the destruction of the Syrian people in the last 10 years could basically take their revenge. I wouldn't like to be a Shiite in the Bekaa Valley after Hezbollah confrontation with Israel, because there are so many blood accounts to settle in Lebanon and Syria. So the risks that they are running are very high. The arrogant assumption about Israel's weakness may be one of those cases in which hubris may mislead them at the point of decision.
It is quite correct if one looks at preemption. Israel is not going to initiate a war, but should Hezbollah start something, you are right. The Lebanese population, especially in the south, where there are missiles hidden at homes or near apartments, they are going to suffer immeasurably.
Colonel Neriah?
Yes, well, in every war in Lebanon, the classical idea of the Israeli leadership was, let's put pressure on the population. The population will just go north to Beirut, and the government will just accept our conditions. This will not work. The only thing that will work is a complete defeat of Hezbollah. Israel incursion into Lebanon in order to destroy the infrastructure of Hezbollah till the Bekaa Valley and till Beirut and the Dahia. And then, of course, withdraw to the international border or avoid staying in Lebanon, because this is a territory that we don't have to put there. By doing so, we can allow a new realignment of forces in Lebanon. Otherwise, this country is lost to Hezbollah and is lost to Iran.
Mr. Owen, you spoke about the Chariots of Fire exercise, so did Dr. Lerman, with regard to specifically the commando practice that occurred specifically in Cyprus. A day prior to that, and during that, there was also a long distance maneuver of the Israeli Air Force with roughly 100 aircraft taking place west from Cyprus, more within the Mediterranean. Is Lebanon going to be spared in a nice confrontation with Iran, which, even though the diplomatic track seems to be maintained on a low level, at least behind closed doors, this is not something we can rule out?
Israel, again, is not going to preempt. It does not have the wherewithal to start a war with Iran right now, because it doesn't know how it will end, because Iran will obviously strike back at Israel's and the United States allies in the Gulf. And the Biden administration is not going to encourage Israel to do it. And Israel must take into account the quantities of anti-missile missiles and other munitions in the long haul. Now, Hezbollah, with its almost 200,000 rockets and missiles, probably plans an economy of launching some 2,000 missiles and rockets against Israel a day, most of them against the northern part of Israel, but several dozen against central Israel, especially the Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport, and strategic target area. Israel, on the other hand, would like to shorten the war, and therefore it will launch a devastating attack on South Lebanon, but also Beirut, what Jacques mentioned, the Dahia, the stronghold of Hezbollah. And technology, military technology, has developed so much in the last 16 years since the last campaign that if Nasrallah is banking on some statistical bombing, he is dead wrong, and perhaps may be dead, not only wrong, if he tries it.
It can be also both.
Yes, the point is that this will not be a repeat of 2006. At that time, for a complexity of internal Israeli dynamics, it took a month to basically decide on a major ground incursion beyond some very limited operations in the south. If I understand the mindset of the Israeli high command today, it will start at day one and in full force.
Colonel Neriah?
Well, I quite agree. As I said, there's no other solution in order to eradicate Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the head of the serpent, of the snake, and we have to cut it. And otherwise, The problem is that Nasrallah doesn't understand Israel. He is supposed to be the best Israeli expert explaining it, but he doesn't understand the mentality. He doesn't understand that he sees our reactions are a weakness, whereas our reactions are in fact a result of deep thinking and of a resolve not to enter in any war, but if we are obliged to do so. And his behavior and his explanation of the Israeli position, as I heard in his last speeches, it just presents a fake understanding of the politics in Israel and of the capacity or capability of Israel to react to his arrogance.
Mr. Oren, we're drawing near. We are drawing to the end of the program. Hopefully, not to the end of Lebanon. But I'd like to hear from you a prospect. Where are we heading from here? Keep it shortly, please.
Right now, it may sound controversial or running against what we just said. Right now, Israel prefers Nasrallah to an unknown new leader of Hezbollah because Nasrallah has been quite restrained for the last 16 years. If he changes his policy, Israel will also change its view of him.
Naim Qassem is not a good responsible actor as a replacement?
Maybe we will try it later.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Colonel Neriah, Dr. Lerman, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.